Today we encounter the biblical equivalent of an IKEA instruction manual, but without any pictures. So it's God deciding he wants what's called a tabernacle, which turns out to be largely a tent. And God has some very specific requirements for how this is put together and what it's for and all the gubbins that goes with it. Calling it a tent is somewhat underdoing it, I think, and a more accurate description might be effectively the first ever church. So it's odd that it's a tent, but I guess this is the Israelites out in the desert. But God decides, build me this tabernacle, and he's going to give the instructions for how they do that. This is a rather dry section of the Bible, for want of a better word, so I'm going to skip through a big old chunk and we're going to do Exodus chapters 25 to 31. But literally, God explaining how to make this, how to make that, and how all that fits together. I'm going to take that back, actually. It's not very specific. It's extremely specific. I mean, down to God decreeing that you will build this lamp, and then there's how many little bits are sticking out of it is determined by God and all the rest of it. As part of this, we can determine that God has a fondness for gold, as in the metal. There's some silver as well, but a lot of gold. And also God's favourite colours seem to be blue, purple and red. Not sure if there's any significance in that, but these are very explicit colours and metals to be used. The directions to build the ark, being the ark, not Noah's Ark, the other ark, the one in Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. This is as specific as it is for the rest of it. But it's remarkable, actually, looking up the movie, how they've made the ark in the movie is actually very accurate to how it's explained in the Bible, which I suppose is obvious. With Steven Spielberg's probably going to do that, isn't he? But it's a nice touch to actually suddenly see that the way it's being described in the Bible. It's like, yes, that's clearly what they actually did. In the movie, at least. As part of it, God says what he wants made and how he wants it made. But there's quite a lot of things he wants made for this tabernacle. So I'm going to read it because, high tech and all the rest of it. So God orders a table, a lamp, the ark, as we said, the tabernacle itself, garments for the priest, there's a lot of those, an altar, a basin, and some holy oil for using in ceremonies. Within the tabernacle is an extra little room at the back sort of thing, which seems to be even more sacred than the front bit, and that's where the ark is going to actually go. So I guess these stone tablets with the 10 Commandments on are not going to be put anywhere that anyone can see them. They're going to go in a box covered in gold, put in a sacred place where no one can actually see it. So the theme does seem to be less practicality, more pomp and ceremony. God decides that Aaron, being Aaron who spoke for Moses, because Moses was worried about speaking, is going to become a priest, and Aaron's 4 sons, whose names I am not even going to attempt to pronounce, will also become priests. And then God decrees how their outfits should be made and all the rest of it. But even going to the detail to specify not only that they should wear underwear, but what form this underwear should take. And that's sort of amusing, all the rest of it. But it's actually clearly very, very important, because God does actually say they have this underwear, which they men must wear, so they do not have guilt and then die. So presumably, if you enter the tabernacle commando, you can be put to death for this. So think twice about going to church without your trousers on. The appointment of Aaron and his sons as priests is, or for want of a better word, a bit of a bloodbath. There's a lot of sacrificing going on. There's blood being put on stuff, on people, on altars and all the rest of it. There's a lot of animals copping it as part of this. And an interesting point that emerges is that God's saying he wants some of these animal sacrifices to be burnt because the aroma is pleasing to him. So we can deduce from this that God is a fan of barbecues. And I suppose also that he has a sense of smell. So I guess why wouldn't he? But it's the first instance of the world God created creating smells and he enjoying those. God specifies that the sacrifices are to be made for atonement for sins. So despite the fact that the Israelites have been given all these rules, it seems God is already assuming that the rules are going to get broken, which is sort of annoying, because I was hoping to see what happens if you do as you're told. But it seems that God is already assuming that's just not going to be a thing, despite the fact that these people have seen all these miracles and wonders and all the rest of it, in theory. He also states there is to be a sacrifice of money, and even goes to the extent of saying that the rich and the poor have to pay the same. I think I've interpreted that right, but it seems to say that, a very wordy way of saying that the rich and the poor have to give the same. Perhaps that doesn't matter and fairness isn't a thing, but I found it odd that that's actually stated, as in, if you can't afford it, you still have to do it, and if you can afford tons more and it's almost a nothingy gesture, that's still fine. A bit odd. In case anyone's wondering, the money is to be used for the upkeep of the tabernacle. It doesn't appear to be that someone's just trying to fleece a bunch of people for the purposes of making a big old pile of money for themselves. There's an interesting daily ritual that's specified by God, saying that he wants twice daily lamb sacrifice. Then it seems it's sacrificed with bread and wine as well. So there would seem to be a sort of an inverted parallel with modern day communion. I'm conscious of skipping ahead and talking about communion, but that's one of the things, if anyone's been to church ever, then will have seen the bread and the wine and all the rest of it. This seems to be some sort of early version of that, albeit it's those things being given to God for atonement rather than being given to humans as a symbol of other things. But that's interesting nonetheless, and we'll have to, once we get to the bit where communion happens, we'll have to look at those parallels and see if there is anything to that. There's a fabulous line from God in talking about the tabernacle. He says he will meet the Israelites and the place will be consecrated by his glory. It's amazing what things you can say as God that would not translate well at all if you were a human being. Actually, I can probably think of a few human beings who might utter such a thing, but in general they're not people you're going to want to have over for dinner. And I think it's difficult to separate things that God can say that would make sense if you are God, and then hearing them in human terms and just thinking that's just the words of a human who would be absolutely unbearable. As the final directive, God says that you must honour the Sabbath, and restates the point that if you don't honour the Sabbath then you're going to be put to death. But yeah, that is 6 chapters, very long-winded descriptions of how to build stuff and what it's to be for and how it's to be used. Quite dull. Fortunately for us, it looks like immediately after this the Israelites are going to go completely break all those rules anyway, and then we're going to see what God does about it. So it should get better. And in the meantime, I suppose we've had a bit of an insight into the mind of God in terms of what he wants and all the rest of it. So that all forms a useful part of the big picture, which we'll sum up later on. And otherwise difficult to really conclude much from that. I think that just does seem to be almost an instruction manual part of the Bible. So we'll move on to the next one and see what happens when the Israelites don't do as they're told.